one of the reasons why people are interested in paganism and the occult is because Christianity has become so milk toast and boring and pathetic, right? It's like the deep spiritual aspects, the deep symbolic connections, the powerful cosmic vision, all of this stuff in Christianity, like no one knows about it anymore. And so when someone who's looking for something that is beautiful and powerful and coherent and 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 isn't just this mundane, just this mundane go to church once a week, sing songs and feel good and go back home, it's like they don't want that. And so I have a lot of sympathy for people who are attracted to that stuff, because I think that their motivation is to find deep connections and to find this cosmic vision and all of that. So I think the best way to reach people like that is to understand that Christianity, what Christianity has, and to understand the cosmic vision that Christianity offers, and to understand how connected everything is and how powerful the cosmic vision of the logos and how it manifests itself in the world is, and how symbolic Christianity is.
So one question I get asked a lot is what made me decide to become a Norse pagan? See, I've been Catholic for the past 8 years and a practicing Christian most of my life. I was raised in a non-denominational Assembly of God church. I was baptized at 17 and decided to become a Catholic at about the age of 19. Spent the last better part of a decade with my wife, children, attending Mass multiple times a week, and actively trying to become Catholic and participating in all the church groups and activities. But being Christian never felt at home to me. I was going through a little bit of issues with the church as far as having my son attend the religious formation classes in the midst of the coronavirus breakout, and it became kind of difficult to get him there, and the church started threatening to deny him communion. I felt really uneasy in my soul, and I came home and I prayed about it, and I called out to whatever deity was willing to listen to me, because to me, if Catholicism wasn't an answer, then Christianity itself couldn't be.
Part of the reason people find paganism appealing is that they don't find postmodernism and naturalism and atheism appealing. And they see liberal Christianity, liberal modern Western religions as vacant, empty, cucked, which they are. And so they're looking for something to find that is authentic, that's historical, that has meaning, that can give a principle to heritage, tradition, family, etc. And so the first assumption is that, well, all of Christianity is equivalent to Vatican II Catholicism or liberal Protestantism. And so, number one, that's not the case, right? And so our whole position is that we would actually agree with you in pointing out that those things are pitiful, pathetic husks of religion that are on the point of the deathbed. Think of Nietzsche's critique of the weakness of Christianity, which would be a critique we would agree with if we're talking about the liberal German Protestantism of his day, or the kind of weirdness of the Roman Catholic traditional world with the women saints, the histrionics, the effeminacy, all of this kind of stuff. And we would agree with those critiques. If you read Nietzsche's critiques of the Christianity of his day, they're great. I agree with those. Okay. And I don't think that, properly speaking, they actually apply to classic Orthodox Christianity. So that's what we're here to defend.
I am also a Folkish heathen. I practice the faith of Asatru. I have been converted for about a decade. I've been practicing 100%. Before that, I was researching, doing my research and everything like that. I was elected as Gothi, which is like sort of like a priest of my kindred about 6 years ago, and it's been a wonderful experience rediscovering my faith. However, as a child, I was raised kind of half-ass Catholic, half-ass Christian, kind of like how a lot of us are growing up with boomer parents that we don't really do. We go to church a few times a year, and they the golden rule, and they don't really understand the theology.
First of all, this is a rising trend, especially amongst dissident people out there who are looking for authenticity, looking for tradition, and so forth, which is understandable. But there isn't, first of all, a pagan tradition. So number 10 is going to be that there isn't such a thing. Pagan traditions themselves have always been a reconstruction, something in flux. And so the idea that you can dig up some old pagan tradition isn't really feasible.
It's really important to note that pretty much everything we know from pre-Christian communities in terms of religions and practices and beliefs comes from people who were not actually part of those communities. So it wasn't part of the tradition to write stuff down. That just wasn't a thing. That's something that came later with things like Christianity. So there wasn't a written record of these gods and goddesses, rituals and things like that, which is why you have to be really careful when you say that you're following, the old druid path, because there's not that much that we can definitively say about it. We've got writings from Romans, and we've got a lot of physical evidence like pottery, stonework, things like that, but we don't have somebody writing down, this is the ritual that I did and I'm this and I believe in this. It just wasn't like that. So we're kind of piecing all these things together from just fragments that we find everywhere, mainly from writing of people that did not like these people. So we have to look at it through that lens.
The other thing about the paganism, and you really have to think this through, is the one of the problem with the Neo-Pagans right now is that they're just basically making it up as they go along.
No, that's true.
Right,
We don't really
right.
know.
They don't have that handed down tradition. Like, they're not a link. They're basically necromancers. Like they dug a body out of the ground, and now they're trying to like magically bring it back to life. It's like, dude, that body is dead.
I mean, what is the pagan tradition, right? Is it Rome? Is it Babylon? Is it Egypt? I mean, these traditions, in a sense, adopted older traditions, and they incorporated the gods into their new system when the old gods were conquered. But the idea that there's tribal paganism against imperial paganism poses a bit of a problem. Because how do you know which one is the authentic paganism? Is it the barbarians that fought Rome, or is it Roman imperial paganism?
The whole point is that paganism is a big mishmash, and it's cross cultures, languages, times, and especially because we're now living in the modern day, it is just a crazy time to be alive. You literally have all knowledge at your fingertips, and that's why all these different sort of cultures come together, all these different teachings come together. We don't have a small community that all think the same thing and discuss the same thing with each other. There is so much that you can look at now. So pagan would be an umbrella term that looks at everything pre-Christian. Even, for example, if you followed the Norse gods and goddesses, you might refer to yourself as pagan. Not everyone does, but you might. And a lot of people use it for just generic nature-based practices.
If there's not a real tradition, then how do you have a succession of this? And I think a lot of pagans want to find a tribal succession. They want to find who the handed down lineage. I mean, the idea of tradition presupposes a thing handed down, but handed down from what source? So there needs to be a succession, but that's the immediate problem in a position that has always been basically a reconstruction of something in the past. Who's the authentic successor? Who has the authentic tradition?
It's like we're not atomized individuals. Like we don't exist we don't exist separate from the people that gave birth to us and gave life to us and gave so we are a chain. We are a chain in a history. We are a chain in a series of events, and those series of events brought the West to join with this like Semitic world and fuse a way of being and a way of thinking, which then expanded, and basically civilized Europe,
So in other words, there's no way really to delineate the true or the false from these various traditions. And if a person says, well, that's how this thing works, you don't have to accept a universal principle or standard. Well, we'll get to why that's a problem in a moment. But basically, this means there's not really a philosophy. There's not really a worldview of paganism or neo-paganism, meaning there's not a consistent, coherent morals, epistemology, or knowledge and metaphysics. They might have views of epistemology. They might have views of metaphysics in basically an anti-ethical position, but there's not really a consistent, coherent worldview of all those working together. So let me give you a hypothetical. Let's say that, let's say I have a dream, and I'm being serious here. I'm not trying to be a clown. I'm like, what if I had a dream and I felt like it was my duty to restore the true teachings of Pharaonic Egypt? And so what I do is I go and I kind of construct from the Memphite creation document and the Hermetica and these different ancient texts that we believe come from Egypt, and I put forth a kind of a skeletal approach, and then I build a pyramid out in my backyard, and I get it going, and I say that the true Pharaonic religion requires. I have discovered this through my own research, and I've actually found some scholars that will back me up on this. We've discovered that everybody who follows my cult, that they need to offer their all the hottest daughters all need to be given to me. And that's divine Pharaonic revelation. I am like Muad'Dib. I am the God Emperor. So how would you say that any of this is wrong? How would you say that any of that's incorrect, or on what basis?
What is the fruit of this guy? Like you, what are you proving? How are you
the
proving?
Pharaonic religion that I have constructed, those are good fruits, bro.
But that's not fruits. That's just claims. Like you got to produce something to show that you have
Okay,
divine
well, let's say I
inspiration.
really do this, and I really do have a harem and a whole bunch of supermodel babes, and I act like I'm a god emperor. Like, how is that not the fruits consistent with my revelation in my religion?
Well, how would it if a guy came out like that said he is the next Messiah, and how would you take him? And he could prove it.
Well, I would argue with him the same way I'm arguing with you, is that these constructs kind of break down, because you ultimately have to, when you're going to compare these kinds of systems, you have to go back to things like logic. You have to go back to things like universal claims and principles. And that's going to involve pulling out things like logical fallacies, which I guess you said doesn't really matter.
Well, I actually agree with you 100%. It's 2019. Like we're in current year. So it's going to be kind of hard for a guy to prove to me that he is, the son of Odin, and he's here to establish galactic pagan supremacy, and he's got a whole harem full of,
Okay, but let's say you're not. Let's say that I do this over on my own libertarian island somewhere, and I'm not even messing with your people. What I'm saying is there any basis that you have to say what I'm doing is wrong?
I mean, sure. If you're going against the principles of frith and oath set forth within the Havamal and within the Eddas, then you're not doing a good job.
I'm constructing the true Pharaonic religion.
Yeah, well, no, okay. So number one, if you're constructing the Egyptian religion, I would question you, right away, because you're not Egyptian. You're a white guy, obviously. So
yeah, but there's a good argument to be made that the upper class of Egypt, the upper caste, were actually perhaps Aryan.
Yeah,
so,
I actually agree with that.
But even so, so what? Why do I have to be part of that racial haplogroup in order to be maybe the gods have donned me the new initiator of the new Pharaonic religion?
Pagan is just a lot more of a generic term, and you can just pull in whatever you want from it, because the truth is we don't really know in enough detail what the pre-Christian communities were doing. We have scattered evidence everywhere, and if we were to say, oh, we follow that, you just couldn't do it. There's not enough evidence there. It's about what you feel and what you think, because it is you that is doing these things, and it's about your connection to what you're doing.
And if it's all relative, then there's no way to combat the things that you think you're critiquing. How do you critique Christianity if your system is relativistic? It doesn't have a grounding for its ethic. I mean, if nothing's right and wrong, then there's no basis to critique. You need a standard to justify, give an account for the value judgments to say something is good, bad, right? We should follow strength and willpower over against the weak.
Well, okay, so this gets into the debate of Folkism versus Universalism and perennialism. and that divinity, in our school of thought, divinity is expressed differently among different peoples, and because different people are, as we know in these, in these circles out here on the internet, different people are biologically different. They think differently. They have different attributes. They have evolved in different places. We're just obviously different. It's not one race, the human race. So obviously when something comes down, when they're divinely inspired, they will express divinity in different ways. And that is why it's different. We don't, so I could look at,
So there's nothing wrong with my Muad'Dib God Emperor cult. I'm the Kwisatz Haderach. I got a harem. Nothing wrong with that.
well, there is something wrong with that because you're just coming out with it. There's no basis in ancestry that shows that it's a tradition.
Yeah, but you just said that you had spiritual experiences that led you to your religion. So I'm saying the same thing. I had a spiritual experience. It happened in a dream. I was told that I need to set up the pyramid in my backyard. On what basis is that going to be degenerate?
Yeah, well, number one, it's not like, okay. So here's the fundamental misunderstanding about heathenry is that people that look through a universalist lens still keep looking through a universalist lens. It's not a universal religion that you could just pick up. It's not something that you could just practice. It's not Buddhism. It's not Christianity. It's not something it is an ancestral tradition.
And that night, I had a dream that Gandalf, of all people, or a Gandalf-like person, came up to me. And he placed his thumb in the center of my forehead, and there was a blinding light. I woke up immediately, and I had this rush of energy, something I never felt before, an incredible experience. And I didn't know what it meant, so I Googled up that day. I Googled what Gandalf was. And at that time, I had no knowledge of really Odin outside of, I'd watched a few seasons of Vikings and didn't really care for it. Whenever I looked up Odin and realized that he was based off the character of Gandalf, I realized that's just how he appeared to me.
I had spiritual experiences that I could not explain, that were parallel with a lot of what is talked about in our spiritual texts, which are the Eddas. And I guess it was just revealed to me. I've found things I don't believe in coincidence, but I kind of stumbled upon things and they resonated with me, and it just all kind of came together, and I just ended up here. I can't explain it 100%, in material terms, but it was just I feel that it was a path that I was meant to be on, and the gods revealed all of these wisdoms to me, and this is how I ended up here.
The way that paganism is emerging in the 21st century, paganism 2.0, you're seeing it, one, with the radical left, which is about the sort of hedonistic trends of ancient paganism, but we're also seeing it in the radical right. I mean, the white supremacist movement, these types of people who identify, they're racial essentialists in the sense that that's the only thing that's important. They worship Odin. They do the Roman salute, and yet it fundamentally, at a philosophical level, it breaks down. It's not able to justify universal categories, universal understandings, objective epistemology, objective morals, and ethics.
It's like people always think, it's like the Vikings, especially there's a lot of these Neo-Pagans around, like talking about Thor. It's like, the Vikings, all they were doing were like raping and pillaging and cutting people's heads off before they became Christians. It's like, then when they became Christians, then they were the Normans. Then they were the kings of Sicily and the kings of England. And it was like, then they kicked ass, like seriously, because they had that basis, they had that structure to kind of channel their Nordic whatever energy into, and also because then their Nordic kind of warrior like character could be put in service of the weak, at least ideally, because a Viking with his axe doesn't care about anybody. He just cares about getting the gold and the honor and the women, right? Whereas the knight, obviously in practice it doesn't always happen that way, but at least the ideal of the knight is to fight for the weakest person, to fight for your lady, to fight for the orphan. It's like, that's a huge difference. That's a huge difference. And so we should really freaking dread like the return of of the North, man, because you know what that looks like? That looks like 1930s Germany. That's what it looks like. The return of like that pagan thing, man. It's gonna like it's there's some of that in the air, you know, and it's like you need to realize what that is. It means chopping heads off. That's what it means.
Ancestral traditions are particular, right? There's specific areas or locales within history, geographical places, and so forth. But earlier in the debate, you were making a point to try to say that the point of Odin is that he is a connection to or a manifestation of universal logical laws and principles of mathematics. So
He
those two
is-
things, that's why those two things don't make sense.
I'll make it make sense right now. Odin is the Germanic deity that has come to explain to us of Germanic descent how divinity works. He speaks our language. He looks like us. He is part of us. He's the guy that came to teach us how divinity works. That's what that is.
But how does he look like you if he's the ultimate perennial God nature that's beyond all things?
What do you mean? Look at the depictions of him when he reveals himself to people. Yeah, that's how he manifests. That's how people understand him. That's how people have seen him. That's how people depict him. That's how he's expressed in our folklore. You know, I mean, that's
He's universal, but he appears to specific cultures.
Odin is not
relatively
universal. Odin is not universal. Divinity is universal.
Okay, so is it the same principle that's revealing truths to all these different religions over time and space? That maybe it's not Odin, but it's like an avatar of this same divine principle?
Yeah. So like an equivalent of Odin.
Perennialism?
What's that?
It's perennialism, basically.
Essentially, it is it's very similar to perennialism.
Okay, so the problem with perennialism is that you can't clearly say what is degeneracy and what's not. Is a giant orgy of butt sex, is that degenerate, or is that just part of the rite?
Absolutely degenerate.
R-I-T-E.
It's degenerate.
Why? On what basis?
Well, because it's a dishonorable act. It's a disgraceful act. It's an act of the flesh.
Circle. That's a reification.
Okay, so
you're saying it's bad because it's bad.
I think it has to do with the fact that paganism is much more open to alternate ideas of sexuality, alternate roles for genders, as well as just the emphasis on feminine, which is a very stereotypical thing. It is assumed that many pagans put an emphasis on the feminine over the masculine because we're going against that patriarchy, we're going against the other religions that are so much about the male, which is not always necessarily the case. A lot of us do not take that harsh opposing viewpoint. But I think that's a lot where the draw comes from. I feel that at least on the outside looking in, paganism is something that appears to be much more accepting of sexualities that are not heterosexuality. And so people who have a different spiritual outlook, have a different sexual outlook, feel more comfortable in pagan-like religions than they would in other more mainstream religions.
The pagan worldview is characterized by sort of polytheism, which they see as more of an expressive form of spirituality that allows for, like I said, multiple gender expressions. You can look into, if you're not familiar with the cults of Ishtar or Inanna, and it was very common that some of the priestess there would actually be transgender women. So it'd be men who would then either become eunuchs, or maybe they would keep their genitalia, but dress in a way that would present themselves as female. And some of the females would actually then present themselves as males. So it's not uncommon. And I actually have a thing just looking up for today's stream that there's multiple examples of transgenderism within pagan spirituality. Now, there's also explicit examples in which paganism rejects transgenderism and sometimes even homosexuality. But generally speaking, it was much more accommodating to these things. And I would argue, when we get into this section on the philosophical breakdown on paganism, that it's because paganism is inherently relativistic.
It's fighting or not? Are they just representations of symbolic principles, or are they actual entities that are fighting out there in the world?
I mean, all of the above. It's here's the thing about in heathenry, we don't try to pretend that we understand, and our little human minds can express and really define what is divinity, what are the cosmic mechanics of the universe. We're not going to, so we have the gods to teach us it through story and allegory and scripture, how to understand it and behave properly during our short time on this life in our earthly vessels until we pass on to the next life.
It's a contradiction because it's atheistic on the one hand and anti-supernatural in many segments. Many atheists are disaffected and they become interested in spirituality. They become neo-pagans. And then they retain their atheistic rationalist attitude towards the gods or the deities. But if the gods or the deities aren't real, then there's not really any meaning to paganism other than it being a kind of social organization. And so if it's not a real thing, if it's a social organization, then what's the point of the gods? What's the point of the myths? Do you have access to the ultimate divinity that's beyond Odin, that's present as the skeletal outline of all religions?
I mean, we see it every day. It's everything is an expression of the divinity.
So it's monistic.
Yeah, sort of.
Okay, so if monism is true, this breaks down at a really fundamental philosophical level. If monism is true, then ultimately everything is at root one, right?
Everything. Okay, so it's not everything is the root one. Everything
is at root one.
Okay, well, so what monism, what you're talking about is that everything is part of the great oneness. Everything is involved in the great oneness. That's not necessarily what I'm saying. What I'm saying is everything is an expression of the great oneness, including the gods, including, which are different for each people. And, that's what I'm getting at here. Now,
Dante says that Fortune is a god and talks about her as a god. And, this is something that for people interested, obviously, in universal history and also kind of the re-mythologization of Christianity, we've been talking about, in some ways, the principalities that God created to run over the world. There's a manner in which, even in the Old Testament, the word used for them is interchangeable. Like the idea that they're gods, they're angels, they're stars, all of this stuff is interchangeable in the Old Testament. And, it would be easy to accuse Dante of a kind of paganism. And we'll see examples of that now in these cantos that we're going to look at. But it's rather better to understand it in the context of this different vision of Christianity, a kind of idea that the gods do exist, like all the gods exist, and that it's not true that there's one God and that there's all of us, that there's a myriad of intermediaries that are in between God and us, that act on us, that contrive our action, that influence us. All of these things are true and do not take away from the idea that we do believe and worship and follow the one true God that is uncreated. And so that's really important to understand.
So what's unique about Christianity, the reason why the Trinity is different in this regard, is that we don't believe in a complete, absolute, unknowable oneness or monism. And we also don't believe in a complete chaotic particularity where everything's crashing against each other and everything's just ruled by chaos. There's actually both unity and multiplicity are in perfect balance in God himself. It's not in perfect balance in a whole bunch of chaotic gods and Zeus having sex with animal, turning into an animal and having sex with women. And it's all chaos and nonsense. And that's another problem, I think, with that view. I'm not trying to get too off course, but there's not really any coherency to the pagan conception. We have a very worked out philosophical and theological perspective that we believe comes from revelation. And what we get in paganism is much more of a kind of sort of primitive, anti-philosophic bias. And so that's why there's naturally a rejection of ideas like objective truth. But the problem is that we see that I think those religions still need and want objective truth just as much as the atheist wants to have an objective universal principle or truth, but he doesn't have any consistent way to talk about it or justify such a thing or give a coherent reason why there would be such a thing in his worldview. The same criticism applies to the neo-pagan or the heathen or whatever, that if chaos and fate rule these things, then you really don't even know if all of reality has this great oneness of divinity that all the other beings participate in by gradation. It's just something that you subjectively read somewhere or made up, and then the next guy could come along and say, no, I'm actually the incarnation of Odin. There is no, on what basis is one of these things true and the other's not?
In the Greek tradition, what's interesting about the Greek tradition is that the very origin of the gods itself seems to
it's as if the conflict seems to, in a certain manner, be seen from the point of view of the gods, but the point of view of like the demons, instead of the point of view of the heaven, the God of heaven. And so, so Zeus, Jupiter, Saturn himself, castrates his father, the God of heaven, that leads to the monsters and to the giants, to the first giants. But then it's just a series of revolutions. And so Zeus, the idea is that Zeus restores some kind of order, but he does so, it by in similar ways. And he also kind of devours his own children. Like there's different versions of it, where he was going to devour his children or he doesn't. And so you have this problem in the Greek pantheon. But for sure, I think that the Christian vision is a better one, because it doesn't imply revolution at the outset. You have an orderly procession of beings from the infinite into the world. And so you have this orderly hierarchy. And then in that hierarchy, there is, because of the separation from the origin, it means that the possibility of seeing yourself as self-sufficient is always possible, because you're not the infinite God. And so because you're not, then you can see yourself as being, the top. And so the idea of the rebellion of Satan, or the idea of the rebellion of the angels at different moments in different versions of the story, is, I think, a better, more complete way of understanding the question of heavenly beings and how they interact with each other. It's been integrated into the wider Christian civilization. And so there's a lot of the Nordic stories that are like and even the Nordic stories we know today, they were written by a Christian. Like the Northmen didn't write down their stories. And so even the ones that we have are already joined with like the Christian tradition.
I could make a whole video about the history of the spread of Christianity and the way that it was done, and a lot of this was done through repurposing old pagan things. For example, you will often find some of the oldest yew trees in the country in churchyards, because this would be sacred old sites, and this was repurposed by the church to make the pagan community feel like it was an easier shift into Christianity. And the two kind of wove together a lot more than we would think they would. Things like Christmas, which is Yule, Ostara, which is Easter, a lot of these holidays repurposed for Christianity.
Christmas is obviously not pagan. It's the celebration of the birth of Christ. How can it be pagan? It's a ridiculous statement to say that Christmas is pagan. Because what do we do at Christmas? We celebrate the birth of Christ. I don't know. It's just funny. Just funny. It's like, it's so obvious that it's not pagan. What do people mean when they say that it's pagan? So what people mean when they say that it's pagan is that in the celebration of Christmas, there are aspects of those celebration which seem to precede the coming of Christianity. And so certain or come from outside of Christianity. So certain traditions that we do, like the Christmas tree, maybe, like the holly, maybe, like wreaths, maybe, that maybe those traditions come from traditions that existed before these people converted to Christianity. Now, first of all, that's already a very tenuous statement, because you know what? People don't know. They just don't. They don't know what the traditions were before, because all of the accounts come from Christians. But whatever. Let's take that. Let's even take that as let's say that that's real. That some of the traditions that are celebrated at Christmas come from outside of Christianity. The answer to that is, who cares? Who cares, really? Just because things come from outside of Christianity doesn't mean that they're bad, right? Especially if they can be used and integrated and brought together and then used to worship to worship God. Do you think that the tabernacle and the sacrificial system that was given to Moses, that the tripartite separation of holy space, that the sacrifice of animals, that were the way that it was told for that the Israelites do, that a kind of sacred box, on which the God descends. You think that didn't exist before the revelation to Moses? You think that you're going to have a bad surprise when you start to realize that the tripartite structure of a temple is a universal structure that exists in every culture. And so is it pagan because of that? Why? It's like, because pagans have doors and Christians have doors, it means that if you go through a door, then you're a pagan? It's just ridiculous.
So there's room, and that's what the night, that's what I keep telling people. It's like there were no nights until the Northmen converted. Like, the idea of the night is the joining of, like, Rome joined with let's say a Semitic world and created a certain way of being, like a Christian empire, let's say. That the ideal of that is like Byzantium, let's say. But then that world joined with the northern people and created like the holy warrior, because it wasn't there before. And this whole idea of the night is really the joining of the northern way of seeing the world with the southern. And that's why like even in Byzantium, the army of the emperor, the guard of the emperor were the Varangians. So the Varangians were all these Norwegian types, like Danish types, who came to Russia and became the elite of Russia. And when they converted to Christianity, it's like then they became the real army of the Byzantine emperor. And it was like it's like you have to be able to see, and then we're the legacy of that. And so to go back and to say Thor, it's like, why do you say Thor? Like, why don't you say St. George? Everything that you want in Thor is in St. George, and you don't have to dig up a dead body to get St. George. Like, there's still churches named after him in your town, probably.